Thomas Blackwell had searched every corner of London for 3 months. The merchant's son had vanished without explanation one October morning in 1349, leaving behind his apprentice robes and nothing else. Thomas posted notices, questioned beggars, bribed city guards. His wife had died of grief within 6 weeks. Now, in the depths of January, Thomas found himself in Southwark's worst alley, following a tip from a drunk who claimed to have seen a boy who moves like a dog. The stench hit him first. Rotting vegetables, human waste, and something else. Something dead. Thomas pressed his perfumed handkerchief to his nose and pushed deeper into the narrow passage between 2 crumbling buildings. That's when he heard it. A wet, tearing sound, like fabric ripping, but organic. He turned the corner and stopped breathing. A figure crouched in the shadows, hunched over something dark on the ground. The posture was wrong, too low, too animal. But the threadbare tunic was familiar. Thomas had paid 2 shillings for that cloth. The figure's hands worked frantically, bringing something to its mouth again and again. The wet sounds continued. "William," Thomas whispered. The figure went rigid. Slowly, it turned its head. The face that looked back at Thomas was his son's. And it wasn't. The eyes were the same gray-blue William had inherited from his mother. But they were empty, vacant. The mouth was smeared with something dark. In William's hands, clutched like a precious meal, was a dead rat. Half eaten, Thomas took a step forward. "William, it's father. It's me." The boy's lips pulled back, not in a smile, in a snarl. The sound that came from his throat wasn't human. It was the warning growl of a cornered animal protecting its food. William's fingers tightened around the rat carcass. Blood and fluids dripped between his knuckles. "Son, please." Thomas extended his hand, fighting the urge to vomit. "Come home. Whatever's happened, we can fix it." William's response was to shove the entire rat head into his mouth and bite down. The crunch of small bones echoed in the alley. His eyes never left his father's face. There was no recognition there, no humanity, just the blank stare of something that used to be a boy. Thomas fell to his knees. He wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. This thing wearing his son's face continued eating, now pulling at the rat's intestines with teeth that seemed sharper than Thomas remembered. The boy's fingernails were long, broken, crusted with filth and old blood. "How long?" Thomas managed to ask. "How long have you been like this?" William tilted his head, the gesture disturbingly canine. Then he opened his mouth and made a sound. Not words. Something between a whimper and a hiss. And Thomas understood with perfect, horrifying clarity. His son couldn't speak anymore. The boy who had recited Latin poetry at 12 years old couldn't form human words. A church bell tolled in the distance. William's head snapped toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Thomas saw the rest of the alley. Bones, dozens of them. Small skeletons picked clean. Rat tails arranged in a pile like trophies. And scratched into the wall behind William, done with fingernails or perhaps teeth, were marks. Tallies. Days counted. Months. This hadn't started yesterday. William had been living like this, eating like this for weeks, maybe longer. Thomas stood on shaking legs. He reached for his son one more time. William lunged, not to embrace his father, but to bite. Thomas jerked backward, feeling teeth snap shut inches from his wrist. The boy landed on all fours, crouched in a defensive position Thomas had only seen in dogs. "I'll come back," Thomas said, backing away. "I'll bring help. I'll bring food. Real food." But as he stumbled out of the alley and back into the grey London morning, Thomas knew the truth. Whatever was crouched in that alley eating rats wasn't his son anymore, and the worst part was yet to come. Because if William had been missing for 3 months and living like this in the city, surviving on vermin and God knows what else, that meant one terrible thing. He had chosen this. 6 months earlier, the Blackwell family had been unremarkable in their comfort. Thomas ran a moderately successful cloth merchant business. His wife, Eleanor, managed their household with quiet efficiency. William, their only surviving child after 3 others died in infancy, was the family's pride. At 14, he was apprenticed to a goldsmith, a position that cost Thomas nearly a year's profit to secure. The boy was brilliant, everyone said so. Father Benedict at St. Mary's Church had called William the finest student he'd taught in 20 years. The goldsmith, Master Aldrich, reported that William's hands were unusually steady, his eye for detail exceptional. There was talk of William becoming a master craftsman himself by age 25, perhaps even serving the royal household. But Thomas remembered details now that he'd ignored then, small things that hadn't seemed important until his son was crouched in an alley eating rats. It started in July. William came home from his apprenticeship with scratches on his arms. When Eleanor asked about them, he said he'd fallen into a thorn bush. Plausible, unremarkable. Except the scratches were in the wrong pattern, not like thorns at all, like fingernails clawing at skin. 2 weeks later, William stopped eating at the family table. He claimed the rich foods made his stomach hurt. Eleanor prepared simpler meals: bread, cheese, watered wine. William picked at everything. He was losing weight. His face grew gaunt. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. "The boy's working too hard," Thomas told Eleanor. "Master Aldrich is pushing him." But when Thomas visited the goldsmith's shop, Aldrich pulled him aside. "Your son hasn't been coming to work regularly. Sometimes he arrives at dawn, sometimes not until afternoon. Yesterday, he didn't come at all." Thomas confronted William that evening. The boy's response was mumbled, incoherent. He couldn't explain where he'd been, wouldn't meet his father's eyes, just kept scratching at his arms, at his neck, like his skin was crawling with invisible insects. Eleanor found the meat first. Hidden under William's bed in their small house. A piece of mutton, 3 days old and starting to rot. When she demanded an explanation, William snatched it from her hands and ran from the room. They heard him in the kitchen, heard the desperate sounds of eating. When Thomas entered, William was shoving the spoiled meat into his mouth, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," William sobbed between bites. I'm sorry, I can't stop." "Can't stop what?" Thomas asked, pulling the meat away. "What's wrong with you?" But William just shook his head. He looked terrified, not of his father, but of himself. "Something's wrong inside me. Something's changing." They brought in a physician. The doctor examined William, checked his humors, prescribed bloodletting and a diet of bland porridge. The treatments did nothing. William grew thinner, more withdrawn. He stopped sleeping in his bed. Eleanor found him one morning curled in the corner of his room, sleeping on bare floorboards like a dog seeking cool stone. The goldsmith terminated William's apprenticeship in August. "The boy's got devil sickness," Master Aldrich said. "I won't have it in my shop." In September, William started disappearing for hours, sometimes overnight. Thomas would find him returning at dawn, clothes filthy, hands and face covered in grime. The boy wouldn't explain, just went to his room and closed the door. Eleanor begged to take him to the priests. "It's demonic possession," she insisted. "Father Benedict can perform an exorcism." Thomas resisted. Exorcisms were public, humiliating. They would destroy William's reputation, what little remained. There had to be another explanation. An illness, a fever affecting his mind. Something medical, not supernatural. Then came October 1st. Thomas woke to find Eleanor screaming in the kitchen. William was gone, but he'd left evidence of his final night in the house. Every piece of food in the larder had been torn open, not eaten, just destroyed. Bread crushed to crumbs, cheese smeared on walls. And in the middle of the kitchen floor, a dead mouse, partially eaten. "He's been taking the rats from the traps," Eleanor whispered, her voice broken. "I thought cats were getting them, but it was William. Our son has been eating the vermin we catch." She didn't last long after that. The shame, the horror, the complete incomprehension of what their child had become. It consumed her. Eleanor stopped eating, stopped speaking. Within 6 weeks, she was dead.
The physician called it melancholy. Thomas called it what it was. His wife died of a broken heart because their son had turned into a monster.
Now, standing in that alley watching William crouch over rat corpses, Thomas understood. This hadn't been sudden. The transformation had been happening for months. Slowly, progressively, each day taking his son further from humanity and closer to something else. And the most terrifying part? William's eyes in that alley hadn't shown madness. They'd shown acceptance. Whatever was happening to him, whatever compulsion drove him to eat vermin and live in filth, William had stopped fighting it. He had surrendered to becoming something other than human. But surrendered to what? And more importantly, could Thomas bring him back from it? Or was his son already gone, leaving behind only this creature that wore his face and fed on dead rats in dark alleys? The answers Thomas would discover would be worse than any he could imagine. Thomas returned to the alley the next morning with bread, cheese, and cooked meat. He found William in the same spot, surrounded by fresh rat carcasses. The boy didn't acknowledge the food his father brought. He just continued eating what he'd caught himself, methodically stripping flesh from tiny bones with teeth that Thomas swore looked different. Longer somehow, more pointed. "I brought a physician," Thomas said, gesturing to the nervous man standing behind him. "Master Geoffrey. He's from the university. He can help you." Master Geoffrey approached cautiously, his pomander held firmly to his nose. He knelt beside William, who ignored him completely, and began his examination. What he found made him recoil. "His fingernails," Geoffrey whispered. "They've grown nearly an inch in what? 3 months. That's not natural growth. And look at his teeth." Thomas leaned closer. William's mouth hung slightly open as he chewed. His canines were definitely longer, sharper. The gums around them looked inflamed, almost like new teeth were pushing through. "His skin," Geoffrey continued, lifting William's arm. The boy didn't resist, didn't even seem to notice. "See these patches? Discolored, roughened, like scales almost. And the smell. Beneath the obvious stench of filth and rot, there was something else. Something musty and animal, like the smell of a stable or a rat's nest. It seemed to come from William's pores, as if his body was secreting it." Geoffrey pulled out his instruments. He checked William's pulse, examined his eyes with a candle, pressed on his abdomen. The boy tolerated it all with complete indifference, only becoming agitated when Geoffrey tried to take away the rat corpse he was holding. "The humors are severely imbalanced," Geoffrey finally declared. "Black bile has completely overwhelmed the others. It's corrupting his blood, changing his very nature. I've read of such cases in ancient texts. Lycanthropy, they called it. But not the kind that transforms men into wolves. Something else. Something that makes them more like the vermin they consume." "Can you cure it?" Thomas demanded. Geoffrey's expression said everything. "I can try treatments. Bloodletting to drain the corrupted humors, purgatives to cleanse the bowels, herbs to restore balance. But in cases this advanced..." He trailed off, looking at William with something between pity and disgust. "Master Blackwell, your son's body is physically changing. His digestive system may have adapted to his diet. His teeth are reshaping. His mind is gone. Even if we could stop the progression, I don't know if we could reverse what's already happened." They tried anyway. For 2 weeks, Geoffrey came daily with his treatments. William was bled until he was pale and weak. He was forced to drink purgatives that made him vomit violently. Herbs were burned around him while prayers were chanted. Nothing worked. If anything, William grew worse. His hair began falling out in patches. His spine curved, making him even more hunched. He stopped making any human sounds at all, communicating only in hisses and growls, and his appetite intensified. Thomas watched in horror as his son caught a rat with his bare hands, killed it by biting through its skull, and ate it raw while it was still twitching. "The treatments are killing him faster than the disease," Geoffrey admitted after William collapsed during a particularly brutal bloodletting. "His body can't process normal human medicine anymore. It's as if he's become something else, something that operates under different rules. Father Benedict tried next. The priest came with holy water, sacred relics, and prayers for exorcism. He blessed William, sprinkled him with consecrated water, held a crucifix before his face. William's only response was to try to bite the crucifix. "Demon," Father Benedict declared, jumping back. "This boy harbors an unclean spirit. I can see it in his eyes. The devil has claimed him." But the exorcism that followed was a disaster. Father Benedict commanded the demon to leave in Latin, in English, in every holy language he knew. William just stared at him with those empty eyes, occasionally snapping his teeth like he was trying to catch flies. When Father Benedict touched holy oil to William's forehead, the boy's only reaction was to lick it off and grimace at the taste. "I don't think it's possession," Thomas said quietly. "I think it's something worse. I think my son is still in there, trapped, watching himself become this thing and unable to stop it." Father Benedict's face went pale. That would be a cruelty beyond imagining, to be conscious, aware, and still unable to control your own body and mind. To know you're eating rats and living in filth, and be powerless to stop yourself. He made the sign of the cross. May God have mercy on his soul, because there's nothing we can do for his body. Thomas spent his nights researching, reading every medical and religious text he could find. He discovered references to similar cases throughout history. People who developed insatiable appetites for strange substances. Children who stopped eating human food and survived on things that should have killed them. Most of the accounts ended the same way. Death within months, or execution for being demonic. One text mentioned something called pica, a compulsion to eat non-food items, but that didn't explain the physical changes, the teeth, the nails, the way William moved. Another manuscript described a condition where famine victims, after eating nothing but rats during sieges, could never return to normal food. Their bodies adapted to the vermin diet and rejected everything else. Was that what happened to William? Had he started eating rats during some crisis Thomas didn't know about, and his body had simply adapted? But that didn't explain why he'd started in the first place. William had access to food. The family wasn't wealthy, but they'd never starved. Then Thomas found a disturbing entry in a physician's journal from a century earlier. It described a boy in France who'd been lost in a forest for weeks. When found, he was eating worms and beetles, drinking from puddles, living like an animal. His rescuers tried to rehabilitate him, but the boy never recovered. He lived for 3 more years, but his behavior remained animalistic. He died trying to eat a poisoned rat placed out for pest control. The physician who treated him theorized that extreme trauma, combined with isolation and starvation, could break something fundamental in the human mind. The boy's survival instincts had overridden his humanity. Once that switch was flipped, there was no flipping it back. Thomas closed the book with shaking hands. Is that what happened to William? Some trauma Thomas never knew about? Something that had shattered his son's mind so completely that he'd regressed to pure survival instinct? But even that theory had holes. Because William hadn't been lost in a forest. He'd been home, in London, with access to his family, his apprenticeship, his normal life. What trauma could have been so severe that it broke him this badly without anyone noticing? The answer would come from an unexpected source, and it would reveal that William wasn't alone, that there were others like him, living in the shadows of the city. A whole community of the broken and transformed, existing in a nightmare world that most Londoners never saw. And William wasn't just a member of that community, he was something worse. He was their leader. Thomas followed William one night. He waited until the boy left his alley to hunt, then trailed him through the darkness. What he discovered made his blood freeze. William wasn't scavenging alone, he was meeting others. They gathered in an abandoned cellar beneath a ruined church near the Thames. Thomas watched from above through a gap in the floorboards, barely breathing, trying not to be sick. There were perhaps 20 of them, children mostly, ranging from ages that looked as young as 6 to William's 14 years, but also a few adults, or things that used to be adults. They all shared the same characteristics: The hunched posture, the long nails, the vacant eyes. They communicated in hisses and growls, but there was structure to it, pattern. They were talking to each other in some debased language only they understood. And they were bringing offerings. Each one arrived carrying dead rats, sometimes pigeons, once a dead cat. They placed their kills in the center of the cellar like tributes, and William, Thomas's son, was the one who distributed them. He decided who ate what, who got the best portions. The others deferred to him, stepped back when he approached, waited for his approval before taking food. William was their king, the king of rat-eaters. Thomas watched as his son took the largest rat from the pile, bit into it, then passed pieces to the others in some hierarchy Thomas didn't understand. The smaller children ate last, receiving only scraps. One little girl, perhaps 7 years old, with matted hair and a face smeared with filth, crawled forward, whimpering. William looked at her for a long moment, then handed her a rat corpse. She took it with both hands and retreated to a corner to eat, making small sounds of contentment. How had this happened? How had 20 people in London become this? Surely their families had searched for them. Surely the city authorities knew something was wrong. Thomas descended into the cellar through a broken doorway. Immediately, every head turned toward him. The sounds stopped. 20 pairs of empty eyes fixed on him in the torchlight. For a moment, Thomas thought they would attack. But William stood, made a low growling sound, and the others relaxed. His son recognized him. Even in this state, even after weeks of living like an animal, William knew his father. "Are these your friends?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking. "Is this where you've been?" William tilted his head, made a sound that might have been affirmation. Thomas looked around the cellar. In the corners were nests made of rags and straw. Bones were piled everywhere. The walls had scratches on them, marks and symbols that might have been attempts at writing or might have been meaningless. And the smell was overwhelming. Death and waste and sickness. "Who are you?" Thomas asked the others. "Where are your families?" A woman, perhaps 30 years old but looking ancient, crawled forward. Her dress was in tatters. Her hair had fallen out in patches, leaving her scalp scarred and leprous. She opened her mouth and Thomas saw that she had no tongue. Someone had cut it out. "Dear God," Thomas whispered. The woman made gestures, pointing to herself, to the others, to the outside world above. Her meaning was clear. They had been cast out, abandoned, condemned as demon-possessed or diseased. Some had been mutilated to mark them as cursed. Others had escaped from places where they'd been locked away, and somehow they'd found each other. Created this society of the damned in the rotting underbelly of London. An older boy, maybe 16, crawled closer. Unlike the others, his eyes showed intelligence, awareness. When he opened his mouth, words came out. Slurred, broken, barely understandable, but words. "We eat what finds us," the boy struggled to say. "Nothing else stays down." "What do you mean?" Thomas demanded. The boy gestured to his stomach. "Tried. Real food. Body. Won't take it. Only this." He held up a rat tail. Thomas felt dizzy. "You're saying your bodies can only digest rats now? That's impossible." But was it? He'd seen William vomit up the good food Geoffrey tried to feed him. Had watched his son refuse bread and meat while devouring vermin. What if their digestive systems had actually changed? What if, like animals that adapted to specific diets, these people's bodies had transformed to survive on what they'd been forced to eat? "How long have you been like this?" Thomas asked. The boy held up fingers. 5 years. He'd been living in the sewers and cellars of London for 5 years, eating rats, losing his humanity piece by piece. Thomas turned to William. "How did you find them? How did you become one of them?" William just stared at him. But another child, a girl of perhaps 10, crawled forward. She pointed to William. then made a gesture Thomas recognized. A coin. She was mimicking counting coins. The goldsmith. Something had happened at Master Aldrich's shop. Something that had started William on this path. Thomas ran from the cellar and didn't stop until he reached Aldrich's house. He pounded on the door until the goldsmith answered, clearly annoyed at being disturbed so late. "What did you do to my son?" Thomas demanded. Aldrich's face went white. "I did nothing. The boy went mad on his own." "Liar. That girl down there, she made the gesture for money. What happened at your shop?" Aldrich tried to close the door, but Thomas forced his way inside. In the goldsmith's workshop, Thomas saw it immediately. The signs of a struggle. Old bloodstains on the floorboards, poorly cleaned. A broken apprentice bench in the corner. "Tell me," Thomas said quietly, "or I'll bring the authorities." Aldrich collapsed into a chair. "It was an accident. William discovered I was shorting him wages, taking coins from what I owed him. When he confronted me, I lost my temper, hit him, harder than I meant to. He fell, struck his head on the anvil. I thought he was dead. You left him to die. I dragged him to the cellar. I didn't know what else to do. I was going to bury him after dark. But when I came back, he was gone. He'd crawled away somehow. I assumed he'd died elsewhere. I never thought—" Aldrich looked up with desperate eyes. "I never thought he'd become what he is now." Thomas understood. William had lain in that cellar, probably for days, with a head injury that had damaged his mind. Starving, desperate. The rats had come, as rats always did in cellars, and William, in his madness and hunger, had eaten them. Once he'd started, his body had adapted, changed, and when he emerged, he was no longer entirely human. He'd found the others like him, or perhaps they'd found him. Either way, William had discovered that he wasn't alone in his transformation. There were others who'd been broken by trauma, by starvation, by desperation, and together they'd created a grotesque parody of society in the darkness beneath the city. Thomas left Aldrich's house without another word. There was nothing to say. The damage was done. His son was gone, replaced by something that ruled over a kingdom of broken children and adults living like animals in the sewers. But even knowing the cause didn't answer the most important question. Could William be saved? Or was he too far gone, too transformed to ever return to humanity? The answer would come soon enough. And it would be more horrific than Thomas could possibly imagine. Thomas spent the next week trying everything he could think of to save his son. He brought physicians, priests, even a woman who claimed to practice ancient healing arts. None of them could help. Most fled after one look at the cellar and its inhabitants. The city authorities were worse than useless. When Thomas reported what he'd found, the alderman's response was chilling. "Master Blackwell, we know about the rat eaters. We've known for years. There are colonies of them all over London, in the sewers, in abandoned buildings, under the docks. We estimate perhaps 200 living in the city." 200? Thomas couldn't comprehend it. How is that possible? Plague orphans mostly. Children who survived the Black Death but went mad from starvation and trauma. Beggars who turned to eating vermin during famines. The mentally afflicted who were cast out by their families. They congregate in the darkness and— The alderman gestured vaguely. "They persist. And you do nothing? What would you have us do? Round them up? Imprison them? Execute them?" "They're not breaking laws, Master Blackwell. They're just existing. If they stay in the shadows and don't bother decent people, we leave them alone. The alternative is mass extermination, and the church frowns on killing the afflicted, even when they're living like animals." Thomas wanted to rage, to demand action, but he saw the truth in the alderman's tired eyes. The city had bigger problems: plague, crime, poverty. A few hundred people living in cellars eating rats simply wasn't a priority. "What about returning them to their families?" Thomas asked desperately. "You're welcome to try with your own son, but I warn you, it never works. Once they've turned, They can't turn back. Their minds are gone. Their bodies have changed. They belong to the underground now. Thomas refused to accept it. He began visiting the cellar daily, bringing William what he thought his son needed: blankets, clean clothes, medicine. William ignored all of it. He only showed interest when Thomas accidentally brought a sack that had a dead mouse in it. The boy's eyes lit up, and he devoured it immediately. The other rat-eaters watched these visits with disturbing intensity. Thomas realized they saw him as an intruder, a threat to their leader. The woman with no tongue made aggressive gestures whenever Thomas approached William. The older boy, who could still speak, warned him in broken words. He chooses this. Let him be. He's my son, Thomas shouted. He's 14 years old. He should be learning a trade, getting married someday, having a normal life. The boy's laugh was a horrible, rattling sound. Normal. Dead. This. Alive. He. King here. Respected. Fed. Safe. Safe. The word haunted Thomas. Was William actually safer living in a cellar eating rats than he would be in the world above? The world that had broken him, that had allowed a goldsmith to beat him nearly to death and face no consequences, that had turned its back on hundreds of suffering people. Thomas tried forcibly removing William one night. He brought 2 hired men, strong laborers who owed him money. They grabbed William and tried to drag him from the cellar. The other rat-eaters attacked immediately. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't strategic. It was pure animal rage. 20 bodies throwing themselves at the intruders, biting and scratching and tearing. Thomas and his men barely escaped with their lives. One laborer lost 2 fingers to a child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The other had his face so badly scratched that he'd carry the scars forever. Never again, the man said, spitting blood. Your son's a demon. Let him rot in hell with the others. Father Benedict tried one final time. He brought holy relics, the most powerful the church had. A fragment of a saint's bone, water from the Jordan River, a thorn supposedly from Christ's crown. He descended into the cellar alone, armed with faith and determination. The rat-eaters let him approach William. They seemed to understand this was some kind of test. Father Benedict knelt before Thomas's son, held up the relics, and began to pray. William looked at the priest with those empty eyes. Then very deliberately he reached out and touched the saint's bone. Nothing happened. No burning, no screaming, no sign of demonic presence at all. William held the relic for a moment, then lost interest and dropped it. Father Benedict's face crumpled. There's no demon here, no possession, just a boy whose mind has been destroyed by trauma and whose body has adapted to survive in ways God never intended. I'm sorry, Thomas. Your son is gone. What remains is something else. Something that has the right to exist, even if we don't understand it. That's when Thomas realized his terrible choice. He could keep fighting, keep trying to force William back into a world he no longer fit. In the process, he would likely get his son killed, either by his own hand in mercy or by authorities who decided the rat-eaters were a problem that needed eliminating. Or he could accept what William had become, let him live in his underground kingdom, eating vermin and ruling over the broken. It wasn't really a choice at all. Thomas stopped visiting the cellar. He told himself it was mercy. William was happy there, in his way. He had purpose, community, safety, things the world above could never give him. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Thomas couldn't bear to see what his son had become. Couldn't face the reality that the bright, promising boy was gone forever, replaced by a creature that ate rats and communicated in growls. Winter came. Thomas heard rumors that some of the rat-eaters had died. The cold, the damp, the lack of proper nutrition eventually caught up even with their adapted bodies. He didn't investigate, didn't want to know if William was among the dead. Then, in February, the city decided to clean the old cellar beneath the ruined church. They were going to demolish the building. make room for new construction. Thomas heard about it too late. By the time he reached the site, the workers had already sealed most of the exits. They weren't trying to kill the rat-eaters. They simply didn't know anyone was down there. And the rat-eaters, living in darkness and silence, hadn't made their presence known until it was too late. Thomas could hear them below, scratching at the stones, making sounds that were almost, but not quite, human cries for help. He begged the workers to break through, to open passages for escape. But the foreman refused. "The whole structure's unstable. We open those walls, the entire building could collapse. Kill my men and whoever's down there anyway. Best to let it fall, then dig out survivors." "My son is down there," Thomas screamed. "Then you should have kept better watch over him," the foreman said coldly. "Not my problem if people choose to live like rats." Thomas clawed at the stones himself until his fingers bled. Other families appeared, people who'd been hiding the same shameful secret. Parents of children who'd vanished into the underground. Siblings of the afflicted. Husbands of women who'd transformed. They all begged and screamed and tried to break through. The building collapsed 3 hours later. The sound was deafening. When the dust settled, there was nothing but rubble where the cellar had been. The workers began the careful process of excavation, looking for bodies. But bodies weren't what they would find. It took 4 days to clear enough rubble to reach the cellar. Thomas stood with the other families, waiting for news of survivors. Deep down, he knew there would be none. No one could survive that much stone and timber falling on them. He was wrong. When the workers finally broke through to the cellar, they found a space that had partially survived. One corner, reinforced by old Roman foundations, had held. And in that space, clustered together for warmth in the February cold, were 11 of the rat-eaters. Alive. But William wasn't among them. The survivors were brought up into the light. Most immediately retreated from the sun, covering their eyes, making distressed sounds. The woman with no tongue was there. The older boy who could speak. Several of the younger children. They were taken to the church where priests tried to care for them. None would accept human food. Within days, most had escaped and vanished back into London's shadows. Thomas demanded to search the rest of the rubble. The workers were reluctant, but his grief was so intense that they agreed. It took another 3 days of digging before they found the second chamber. This one hadn't survived intact. The ceiling had collapsed completely, crushing everything beneath. The workers found bodies immediately. Small, broken things that had once been children. Adults twisted into unnatural positions by falling stone. Thomas identified them by their clothes, by their size, by features that remained recognizable despite the damage. Then they found William. He was at the back of the collapsed chamber, surrounded by the bodies of the smaller children. It looked like he'd been trying to shield them when the ceiling came down. His body had taken the brunt of a massive timber beam. But that wasn't what made the workers step back in horror. William's arms were wrapped around 3 small children, holding them close, even in death. And in his mouth, clutched between his teeth, was a rat. A dead rat that he'd been feeding to the smallest child, a girl of perhaps 6, when the ceiling collapsed. The child still had William's fingers in her mouth, where she'd been trying to take the offered food. In his final moment, William had been taking care of his subjects, feeding them, protecting them, being exactly what they needed him to be, a leader, a provider, a king of the broken and damned. The city coroner performed examinations on all the bodies before burial. What he found in William's corpse became the subject of whispered conversations in medical circles for years afterward. William's teeth had been actively changing. New growth in the jaw showed that within another year, he would have had a completely different dental structure, more suited for tearing flesh than chewing cooked food. His fingernails had grown so long and strong that they'd penetrated into the flesh of his fingertips, essentially becoming claws. His stomach lining had thickened, adapted to process partially decomposed meat without becoming sick. But most disturbing were the contents of his stomach. Rat bones, rat fur, and something else the coroner couldn't identify. A partially digested mass that looked almost like a tumor but appeared to be some kind of adaptation. A secondary digestive organ that helped break down the unusual diet.
His body was evolving, the coroner told Thomas privately, creating new structures to help him survive on a diet that should have killed him. In another 5 years, if he'd lived, he might not have been recognizable as human at all. Whatever trauma broke his mind triggered something in his body as well. An adaptive response we don't understand.
The coroner hesitated, then added, the children he was protecting, their stomachs showed the same adaptations. The younger they were when they started eating vermin, the more pronounced the changes. That little girl in his arms, her entire digestive system had restructured itself. She couldn't have processed normal food if her life depended on it, which in a way it did. Thomas arranged for William to be buried in the family plot next to Eleanor. The priest protested, saying William had died in a state of sin, living as an animal. Thomas pulled out his purse and paid enough money to silence all objections. At the funeral, Thomas was alone. No one from the Goldsmiths Guild came. No one from the church where William had studied. Just Thomas, standing over a coffin that held what remained of his son, and the horrible knowledge that William's final act had been one of love. The other families buried their dead in unmarked graves. No one wanted to acknowledge what their relatives had become. The city sealed the cellar permanently and demolished what remained of the church. Within a month, new buildings stood on the site. No memorial, no marker. Nothing to indicate that 20 people had died there, crushed while living as something less and more than human. But Thomas never forgot. He spent the rest of his life researching, trying to understand what had happened to his son. He found accounts from across Europe. Children who'd survived famines by eating rats and never recovered. Plague orphans who'd turned feral. Adults who'd suffered head injuries and regressed to animal behavior. The pattern was always the same. Trauma, starvation, isolation. The human mind breaking under pressure, reverting to pure survival instinct. And sometimes, in the most extreme cases, the body following where the mind led. Adapting, changing, becoming something that could survive in circumstances that would kill a normal person. William hadn't been possessed by demons. He hadn't been cursed. He'd been broken by cruelty and abandonment, and his body had tried to save him the only way it knew how. By making him into something that could survive on what the world's refuse had to offer. Thomas died 5 years after William, never having remarried, never having recovered from the loss. In his final days, delirious with fever, he claimed he could hear scratching beneath the floorboards of his house. Rats, he said, but not ordinary rats. Rats that moved with purpose, that watched him with intelligent eyes. William sends them, Thomas whispered to the physician who attended him, to check on me, to make sure I'm all right. He's still taking care of me, even from beyond the grave. The physician dismissed it as fever dreams. But after Thomas died, the servants who cleaned his house reported finding something disturbing in his bedroom. Scratch marks on the walls, too high for normal rats to make. And in the corner, arranged in a careful pile, were the bones of dozens of rats, picked completely clean. It took the city another decade to fully clear London's underground of the rat-eaters. Some were captured and confined to asylums. Others were killed by pest control workers who didn't realize what they were eliminating. Most simply vanished, retreating deeper into the sewers and tunnels that ran beneath the city. By 1360, the rat-eaters were gone from London, or so the official records claimed. But even today, there are stories. Tunnels beneath the old city where explorers report finding bones arranged in strange patterns. Chambers with scratch marks on the walls. And occasionally, very occasionally, sounds in the dark. Sounds that are almost, but not quite, human. The official cause of the rat-eater phenomenon was listed in medical texts as a combination of mental illness, famine adaptation, and mass hysteria. The church called it a test of faith that some failed. The city authorities called it an unfortunate consequence of plague and poverty. But Thomas Blackwell, in his final written account hidden among his papers and discovered decades after his death, called it something else. I watched my son transform from a bright, promising boy into a creature that ate vermin and ruled over the broken. I saw his body change, his mind shatter, his humanity slip away. And in the end, I saw him die protecting those who were like him, feeding them even as the world collapsed around them. He was not possessed, he was not cursed, he was adapted. Nature's cruel response to a world so terrible that becoming an animal was preferable to remaining human. My son chose rats over men because rats never beat him, never abandoned him, never told him he was worthless. And in choosing them, he became their king. May God forgive us all for creating a world where such a choice seemed reasonable. The medical community dismissed Thomas's account as the ravings of a grief-stricken father. But deep in the archives of medieval medical history, his observations influenced theories about trauma, adaptation, and the breaking points of the human mind and body. Centuries later, scientists would discover that extreme stress can indeed trigger physiological changes, epigenetic modifications, hormonal imbalances that reshape behavior and even, in rare cases, physical structure. William Blackwell wasn't possessed by demons. He was destroyed by human cruelty and rebuilt by his body's desperate attempt to survive. He became a king of rats not through supernatural transformation, but through the darkest kind of natural selection. And in the end, he died doing what any good king does, protecting his people, feeding his subjects, taking the killing blow meant for those weaker than himself. The son Thomas, lost to trauma and adaptation, died a hero to those who lived as he did. In the grotesque kingdom beneath London, William wasn't a monster. He was exactly what they needed him to be. The cruel irony is that Thomas spent years trying to save his son from the darkness, never realizing that in that darkness, William had finally found the one thing the world above could never give him, a place where he belonged.